Okay guys, we're looking at research methods number 7 here, 7th lesson, and this one's all about documents. Now all of the different methods that we've looked at so far, all the kind of experiments and questionnaires and observations and all of that, those all have been what's called sources of primary data. And this is something you should know about from our very first lesson. So they're primary data, they're data that the sociologist, the researcher, has gone out and kind of gathered or created directly themselves. We're going to look at sources of secondary data today. So it's data created by someone else, but then used by the researcher. So somebody else is actually doing the majority of the hard work. They're creating whatever it is that you're going to analyze, and then the researcher comes along, borrows that, and analyzes it, and that's secondary data. So here we've got the two main sources of secondary data, and these will be the next two lessons that we'll be looking at. Firstly, you've got documents, which is today's one, and then you've got official statistics, which will be next time. So we're going to look at documents. They're usually qualitative, so there's a lot of kind of detail and depth. There's a lot of information in there. Allows you to really get an idea of what the person who's created the document, what they're thinking, and these usually haven't been produced for the purposes of sociological research. Okay, these documents, they aren't made so that people can go do research. They're made for lots of different reasons to do with normal life, but then we use them to analyze what's going on in society at the time. So you need to know what the different types of documents are. The two main types are personal documents and public documents. Personal documents will be largely the ones we'll be dealing with when we're talking about using documents for research. They're created by individuals, just ordinary members of the of society, and they generally record details of that person's experiences. So what they're thinking, what happened, what they did. Common examples would be things like letters, or diaries in particular are a good one, but it can be lots of different things as well, including like photographs or paintings. But the idea that they're personal, they're created for personal use, usually by individuals, that's a personal document. A public document has been created by an organization or institution. And so they're for the use of that organization, or sometimes they're for public use. So it can be things like school records, it can be hospital documents, it can be government reports. There's a whole range of different things that could be, usually for use by the organization itself, or sometimes, like with government reports, they're actually made for public use, made for public consumption. Now there's another type of document that you need to be aware of, and this is historical documents. So those can be personal or public, but they were created in the past, often talking about hundreds of years ago, to help us understand a particular time in history. So if I was looking at a written account of the Peasants' Revolt, or the Battle of Hastings in 1066, or different things like that, there's lots of different documents around from history that we can use to try and understand that time. So personal or public, doesn't matter, but if they're written a long time ago and used to understand that point in history, they're historical documents. Okay, we're going to start talking about the strengths and weaknesses of documents, and we'll go through the kind of pervert factors in a second. But there's 4 factors that I need to bring to your attention that are kind of specific to documents that you need to be aware of, the kind of the key ones, the most important ones. So if you get a question on documents, you need to be talking about these. So when using documents, it's important that you talk about kind of authenticity. Is it authentic? Is it what it claims to be? Or is it missing any pages? Particularly when we're talking about historical documents. Did they miss chunks out somewhere? Did they lose chunks? Who actually wrote it? Was it authentically written by the person who supposedly wrote it? Next, you've got something called credibility. Is it credible? Is it accurate? Or is there some level of bias in it? Or was it written 100 years after the event that the person supposedly witnessed? There's issues there of how accurate the document would be based on that, and then we'd say that that's part of credibility. Representativeness, you should already know what that means. But when it comes to documents, it's looking at, well, is is the evidence that it's giving, is that typical of all society? Was it, the king's view rather than the ordinary people's view, if we're talking about historical documents? Because that's very different. It wouldn't be typical, it wouldn't be representative. Does it give us an understanding of everyone in society or just a select few? And that's an important kind of question that you'd have to ask about your document. And the final one that you might have, again, particularly with historical documents, is about meaning, and have the words used changed meaning over time. So again, historical documents, this is really important. Like, for example, the word gay means something very different now than what it did a few hundred years ago. Or was it written in a different language? And do we need specialist skills and to enlist some help to understand it? These four key kind of ideas are things that you'd need to check and kind of find out about before you can actually use your document and trust your document. So they're really important. If you've got them, if you've checked on them, then they're strengths. But if you don't, then they're weaknesses. And so you need to know these, and you can apply them either way. All right, let's move into the pervert factors, so the kind of pattern you're more used to. Firstly, obviously, we've got practical factors. Now, those key strengths and weaknesses I just talked about with authenticity, credibility, representativeness, and meaning, you've got to go away and check the issues around them. That obviously, practically, would take a lot of time. And particularly if you get to meaning and you've got to hire a language specialist or a historian to tell you a bit more about what's in the document, that's going to increase the cost. So whilst you'd need to do those checks so that you can actually use the document, it could practically take some time, take some money, take some resources. On the other hand, though, many documents are easily accessible. And even freely available online. Depends on the type of document, but a lot of this stuff is just out there on the internet, and it's really easy. Just quick Google search and you've got it there, and it's free. So in terms of time and access and cost, it can be really quite strong. There are some exceptions, few exceptions of like special historical documents that are like in museums and need specialist treatment and specialist permission to access. So one example would be the Declaration of Independence that in America. That's in an American museum in a glass cage, and accessing that properly to analyze it would be quite difficult. But there would be online copies of it, word for word, available. So it depends on the document itself, but generally these are easily accessible and sometimes or often free. Due to the fact that you're doing a qualitative analysis, you're looking at going into depth and looking for the detail and trying to find the meaning in what's being written, it can take a lot of time to analyze. It can take a long time to read it all through and pick out the important data and actually analyze that and work out what's being said. If you imagine, reading 20 diaries from teenagers at Hereford Sixth Form College, that's going to take a long time to analyze to get a feel of what life is like at Sixth Form College. Now, they are secondary sources, remember, so they are data that's not been directly created by the researcher, and so it is entirely possible that there's no cost or access issues, and the only time that it takes is the time to analyze. So on the whole, these can be practically quite strong. Once you've done your checks in particular, they can be quite strong. All right, we'll move on to the ethical factors now. So when it's personal documents, the ethics are slightly different than when it's public documents. Personal documents, I mean, obviously the key one there is informed consent. If I snuck into your house and stole your diary, that's incredibly unethical. Or if I, hacked in your computer and stole some of your personal documents to analyze as a sociologist, that also is incredibly unethical. So having permission to analyze whatever it happens to be is obviously important. And the other really important ethical issue with personal documents is making sure that the data that you kind of publish and your conclusions, that they can't be traced back to any individual participants. So anonymity, remaining anonymous, keeping your participants anonymous is really important. If I published, your name and your address and said in their diary they would blah 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 blah, that's really unethical too. Now, if you do those things, if you get permission and keep things anonymous, then it's really quite ethical. There's no issues there, as long as you make sure that you've done that. If you don't do those things, if you're stealing people's diaries or not got permission, and you're publishing personal data, private data, then that obviously is unethical. Now, when it comes to public documents, because they're being made for public use, it's highly likely there's no ethical issues at all. So, for example, the government put together a report called the Macpherson report that was talking about how the police dealt with ethnic minorities and looked at that. That was created for public use and publicly available. So there's no ethical issues obtaining that, analysing that, doing whatever you want to do with that. So on the whole, that's very strong. And the same can often be true with historical documents. And now this is even true sometimes if they're personal documents, like diaries, for example. If they're historical documents and they're kind of readily available, then there's no ethical issues. You don't really need permission. You don't have to worry about anonymity. So, for example, Anne Frank's diary, you can buy a copy of that. You can download it online. You don't have to get Anne's permission or any of Anne's ancestors. It is widely available. And so it's completely ethical to use a document like that. On the whole, what we're saying then is that documents are really quite ethically strong, as long as you make sure with certain personal documents to keep it anonymous and keep informed consent. Okay, next we're talking about reliability. So that's all about how easy is it for someone else to come and do the exact same research that you're doing, how easy it is to replicate. And because generally when we're talking about documents, we're talking about a qualitative analysis, looking at the quality of the information, the depth and the detail. That tends to be unreliable because there's a lot of subjective interpretation. So one researcher might be reading a diary and looking for certain things and be triggered by other words and other experiences compared to another researcher. So it's very difficult for someone to come along, read a diary and analyze it in the exact same way that the original researcher did. So generally what we're saying here, documents, they are unreliable or low in reliability. Now there is another way of analyzing documents or things like documents, which is another research method that you'll learn about in the future, which is called content analysis. And instead of looking for the qualitative data, looking for the depth and the detail and the thoughts and the meanings, that's looking for quantitative data. So that's looking for numbers. So you could analyze a diary and look at the number of times it referred to the woman as a housewife, or just whatever it is, but looking at numbers, looking at statistics, and that, when we look at that, that is far more reliable. So it obviously depends on the focus of your use of documents. Usually it's qualitative, and in that case it's unreliable. It is a way to do it, and there is a way to do it reliably, which is quantitative, and it's called content analysis. There'll be more on that later in the future lesson though. All right, so now we've got validity, how kind of accurate and truthful the information is. Obviously, we talked earlier about some key factors of authenticity and credibility. Now, if you check and you can kind of check and prove that the document is authentic and the document is credible, then it's highly likely to be a valid bit of research. So when you analyze it, if you know it's authentic, you know it's credible, then what you're going to get, your conclusions, are far more likely to be valid. So you've got your document's written by the actual person it's supposed to be written. At the same time, the person, the event you're interested in. Let's say it's 9/11, for example. If someone's written a diary and it was their diary entry on 9/11 or a few days after, that's far more likely to be authentic, far more likely to be credible, far more likely to be valid. If they've written it 4 years later and they're basing it on memory, that's likely to have warped over time. It's likely to have been distorted and probably not as valid. Now, there's another example here where somebody unearthed and managed to find a copy of Hitler's diary. After the Second World War, it had all finished and all of that, but they'd found Hitler's diary. And they took it to auction and they sold it for, I can't remember exactly how much, but they sold it for a lot of money. And actually, it turned out that when they analysed this diary, it wasn't written by Hitler at all. It was a fake. It was written well after Hitler was already dead. But they claimed that it was written by Hitler and sold it, for the purpose of making money. So you've got to be very careful about this. But if you can prove it's authentic and prove it's credible, then it is more likely to be valid. Now, with personal documents, things like diaries as well, they're usually written, they're not written for lots of people to read. They're written for yourself. They're written for private use. And it's highly unlikely that you're going to lie to yourself in your own diary entries. Although that does remind me of the first date I had with my wife, where it was coming towards the end of the date, and I said to her, so you're going to kiss me, or am I going to have to lie to my diary? And that was just a little bit more about how I met my wife there. So the idea is that you're unlikely to lie in a diary because it's why would you? It's only for your own use. So that makes them higher in validity. There are a couple of documents that would be lower in validity because there's more chance of bias, more chance of people trying to shape perceptions. So things like autobiographies, those ones are essentially someone's life story that they've written themselves. That could easily be trying to present a view and a biased view of their life, of what they've done. And you imagine Boris Johnson's autobiography for his time as Prime Minister. He's obviously going to be trying to get you to think of him in a particular way. He's trying to alter or bias your perception. And so those kind of documents can be lower in validity. But generally, documents can be quite valid. Okay, now we'll have a look at an example. So I've tried to give you an example of this type of method as we've gone through the different methods, because it's important that when you're writing about them in an essay, that when you're writing about the strengths and weaknesses, that you can back that up with one of these examples. So in this case, we're looking at some research done by the sociologist Gewertz. And she looked at 14 secondary schools that were serving a variety of different students, different class backgrounds and ethnic groups. And she wanted to have a look at the documentation that they put forward, so their kind of promotional materials trying to attract students. And she also looked at like league tables and things like that, and concluded that basically it was the middle class kids that benefited from the marketization. And schools, she found that schools have become better at marketing themselves to attract the middle class parents. Now, the key thing here that I want you to draw out is that this can be linked to practical strengths. Because it's a secondary source of data, all of those documents would have been readily available from the school website or from the government or the local council, and they're largely all online, so it's very easy to access. There's no cost, it's all available, it's all free, you don't need permission, and you can do it without even leaving the office. So practically speaking, this example kind of supports how strong documents are. Okay, the second R in PERVA is representativeness. Now we mentioned this right at the start as one of the key things. You'd go away and you'd check, well, is this document representative for the kind of society and the time that it was describing? And if you've done that and it's acceptable, and you may have need some historians or some specialists to come and help you with that. But once you've done that, you can say, yes, this is representative. This is a standard, typical diary of a someone who's fairly representative in society, or a number of different diaries, a number of different people, and say, yes, this is representative. But I'm just going to give you another example as well, where one of the issues was that it was unrepresentative. So if you remember the research done by Aries on childhood, where he studied paintings from the Middle Ages, and his conclusion was that children were basically mini adults. So you may remember that phrase. But the problem with that was the only people who were actually in these paintings were the kind of the upper class, were the richer people. They didn't have the working class in the paintings. So actually those documents, you could argue, are unrepresentative. Now, most of the time we can check and we can make sure it is pretty representative. Occasionally you'll have issues when that's not the case, particularly if we're going a long way back in history and we've got very little evidence about the whole of society at the time. Sometimes they'll be unrepresentative. Finally, then, we've got which theoretical perspective is going to value and find use in analysing the documents. And again, there's a whole lesson to come on the difference between these two perspectives. So it'll hopefully become a bit clearer when we've done that as well. We're just going to finish going through the different methods and then we can look at that. But you need to know that it's interpretivists who are the ones that would value documents. Okay, interpretivists are far more interested in qualitative data, and that's generally what we're talking about when we're talking about documents, because you can get a real insight into how someone thinks. You can get a real insight into kind of how they see the world and why they act the way they do. And that's why interpreters value qualitative data. So if you're reading someone's diary, you've got really good access there into how they think. And this links to a key term called Verstehen, which I've mentioned before. It's a German word, and it means like seeing the world through their eyes or walking in their shoes, something like that, empathetic understanding. So with documents, you can, if you're careful, get quite high Verstehen, and that means that the interpretivists would find it very useful. Now, positivists are the other group. They're far more kind of scientific, and they don't see a lot of value in qualitative data. Okay, they're far more interested in quantitative data, statistics and numbers. And the problem they have with qualitative data, which is the case with documents, is it can be too subjective. You know, one researcher reads a diary, comes away with one conclusion. Another researcher reads the exact same diary, comes away with a very different conclusion, which means, you know, the issue of validity and reliability are affected there. So the fact that it's kind of subjective and it's not very reliable, they don't find documents useful. They would find content analysis more useful. So analysing a document for statistics and numbers, they'd find that more useful than the qualitative data. So interpretivists like it, positivists don't. Okay, there we go, that's the end. Make sure you've got a good set of notes. Do the quiz, bring them to lesson, and there'll be the next one, the next secondary source, which is official statistics, next time. Thanks. Have a good day.